Rational thinking frees the divine being from its contingent shape and in antithesis to the unthinking wisdom of the chorus, which produces all sorts of ethical maxims and gives currency to a host of laws and specific concepts of duty and of right, lifts these into the simple ideas of the beautiful and the good. The movement of this abstraction is the consciousness of the dialectic contained in these maxims and laws themselves, and consequently the consciousness of the vanishing of the absolute validity previously attaching to them. With the vanishing of the contingent character and superficial individuality which imagination lent to the divine beings, all that is left to them as regards their natural aspect is the barrenness of their immediate existence. They are clouds, an evanescent mist, like those imaginative representations. The essence of these having been given the form of thought, they have become the simple thoughts of the beautiful and the good which tolerate being filled with any kind of content. The power of dialectic knowledge puts specific laws and maxims of conduct at the mercy of the pleasure and frivolity of youth, which is led astray by it, and provides weapons for deceiving old age with its fears and apprehensions, and which is restricted to life in its individual aspect. The pure thoughts of the beautiful and the good thus display a comic spectacle. Through their liberation from the opinion which contains both their specific determinateness as content and also their absolute determinateness, liberation, that is, from the firm hold of consciousness on these determinatenesses, they become empty. And just for that reason, the sport of mere opinion and the caprice of any chance individuality. Paragraph 746 seems to be taking us a little bit away from Hegel's thematic of discussing first epic and then tragedy and comedy, but there is something of an important element in what's going on here, and there's a lot of very interesting things going on within this paragraph, with some hearkening back to earlier dialectics. And notice that in this particular paragraph, Hegel, in fact, uses the term dialectical, dialektisch, right, in the body of the text, right? Most of the time he's doing dialectics, and of course Hegelian dialectics are much more complicated than thesis, antithesis, synthesis nonsense that people try to say when they're being clever, right? Instead, it's, the subject, the consciousness, examining things, trying things out, seeing what works, what doesn't work. We could go on, and I'm not going to do that right here. But he is going to talk about that here, and a dialectic that has to do with morality or with ethics. So that's hearkening back to some important things within the spirit and the reason section. We also have some reference to the beautiful and the good, and that too to certain things within the reason section, but also going back to thinking about Stoicism, which is not so much about the beautiful, but is about the good as an idea of thought, something that becomes vacuous, like these, can be filled with anything. So let's look at what he says. Rational thinking, vernünftige Denken. This is very much a passage in which the difference between reason or the rational and merely understanding, merely representation-based thinking is quite important. So rational thinking is going to do something. What is it going to do? Frees the divine being, the divine Wesen, right? Which, as we see, is only there in representation from its contingent shape. And then in antithesis, or entgegengesetzt, right? It's not antithesis as in contradiction, it's in opposition to the unthinking wisdom of the chorus. Now, unthinking wisdom of the chorus is not the happiest translation. Unconceptual would be a more literal translation. Begriffslosen not using Begriff, right? Not using the concept or the notion that rational thinking is using and is deriving things from, but rather, again, at the level of representation or perhaps even just feeling, right? So the unthinking wisdom, Weisheit, wisdom is being used here in a sort of ironic sense of the chorus. Now, why the chorus? Well, because the chorus, as we've seen in tragedy, is supposed to be some sort of stand-in between us, the spectator, and the action that is taking place between gods and heroes and other people, other characters. The chorus is a set of characters who lack character but don't necessarily lack opinions, right? And what do they have at their disposal? So there's some very rich moral vocabulary going on here. The chorus produces all sorts of ethical maxims. Now, Hegel doesn't use the word maxim here. Sittensprüche, right? So this is a broader term than merely, say, Kantian maxims or maxims used in other senses in the 18th and 19th centuries, early 19th century, right? Because that's when Hegel's writing this. We could call these rules of thumb. We could call these proverbs, when somebody says, well, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? That is a maxim of prudence. I should favor the things that are closer to me and discount those that are harder to get to, right, in terms of value. And then a host, or, we could use other terms. So there's literally a crowd. And I kind of like this vocabulary. A mess, a mess of laws, right? Actual laws, norms that are governing us. And then he says specific concepts of duty and right. Now notice he's using this term, Begriff, Begriffen, right? But this is supposed to be Begriffslosen. So we've got two different senses in which concept is being used here. And Hegel has done this throughout his works, hasn't he? So Pflichts- und Rechtsbegriffen, conceptions of duty, conceptions of what is right, conceptions of justice, conceptions of normativity, what one ought to be doing. The chorus is offering these, not necessarily all at once in every single play, but this is something that the chorus does, right? And so rational thinking is working on these, and as he says, lifts, hebt, right, these into a host of law, these host of them into the simple ideas of the beautiful and the good. So this whole mess, this crowd of competing and probably contradictory conceptions of what is right, what is wrong, how we should behave, all that sort of stuff is being transformed into something through abstraction, Hegel says, that is a simple idea of the beautiful and the good. So now, that sounds pretty good. Coming back to the divine being, right? He says, with the vanishing of the contingent character and superficial individuality, we've seen this talked about in the previous paragraphs, which imagination lent to the divine beings, all that's left to them as regards their natural aspect is the barrenness, the nakedness of their immediate existence. And then he's got this beautiful phrase here. They are clouds, an evanescent mist, like those imaginative representations, those Vorstellungen, right? And so the gods, as we've already seen, well, they turn out to be pretty stories, cool ideas, almost like, comic book heroes or something like that. And they are themselves, you could say, simple ideas of the good and the beautiful. And he goes on that. He says, the essence of these, having been given the form of thought, that's what they've become. The gods have turned into something that lacks individuality, lacks subjectivity. And now notice he says something here. These will tolerate, these can be filled with any form of content. That's one of the problems with the ideas of the beautiful and the good, is they're not determinate enough, right? They feel good, they sound cool, But what do they really mean? Well, somebody has to come along and give them meaning. And so he says, the power of dialectic knowledge, right? Dialektische Wissen puts, now we go back to here, specific laws and maxims of conduct at the mercy of something. So you can't totally get away from determinacy or specificity, Bestimmtheit, right, in these ideas. And now notice what Hegel says next. At the mercy of, and here we have something like a generational conflict. Although it's a rather one-sided conflict, the young, the newer generation, is showing up the older, right? And so the specific laws and maxims of conduct are at the mercy of the pleasure and frivolity of youth, which is led astray by it. Right? So youth is led astray by this and through their pleasure and frivolity, but it says provides weapons for deceiving old age with its fears and apprehensions, which is restricted to life in its individual aspect. So the younger people, they don't truly know what they're doing, but they've got lots of energy and they enjoy this. And they can take these laws and rules and kind of twist them around. So what do you mean, old man? You know, you've already got this rule in play, and they can engage in dialectic, not in the sense of dialectic that moves forward by itself, but rather well, you say this, but this is also the case, and these can't be held together, so you're a hypocrite, or you're full of crap, or whatever it's going to be. And that leaves people pretty upset, right? So he says the pure thoughts of the beautiful and the good thus display a comic spectacle. So there is still comedy being discussed here, right? Through their liberation from the opinion, which contains both their specific determinateness as content and also their absolute determinateness, liberation from the firm hold of consciousness on these determinatenesses, right? So we are thinking about these things. We are thinking about them in determinate, specified, particular ways. We are engaging in some sort of discussion between actual people or represented people. And as soon as we get away from that towards these ideas, he says, they become empty. Because they're empty, they become, just for that reason, the sport of mere opinion and the caprice, the, contingency of any chance individuality. Anybody can take these simple ideas of the beautiful and the good, and you could say subjectify them, say, well, my understanding of the beautiful is this turd on a plate over here. You don't see that as beautiful? Oh, that violates all of your norms and laws and stuff. Well, too bad, and then people are like, oh, this is terrible, right? And so we wind up in a kind of impasse where nobody's ideas are the ones that get to hold sway, or if they do, it's because of contingencies, right? And we're losing a sense of, you might call it, meaning or necessity that we had previously. Therefore, the fate which up to this point has lacked consciousness and consists in an empty repose and oblivion and is separated from self-consciousness, this fate is now united with self-consciousness. The individual self is the negative power through which and in which the gods, as also their moments, that is, existent nature and the thoughts of their specific characters, vanish. At the same time, the individual self is not the emptiness of this disappearance, but on the contrary, preserves itself in this very nothingness, abides with itself, and is the sole actuality. In it, the religion of art is consummated and is completely returned into itself. Through the fact that it is the individual consciousness in the certainty of itself that exhibits itself as this absolute power, This latter has lost the form of something presented to consciousness, something altogether separate from consciousness and alien to it, as were the statue, and also the living, beautiful corporeality or the content of the epic and the powers and persons of tragedy. This unity, too, is not the unconscious unity of the cult and the mysteries. On the contrary, the actual self of the actor coincides with what he impersonates, just as the spectator is completely at home in the drama performed before him and sees himself playing in it. What this self-consciousness beholds is that whatever assumes the form of essentiality over against it is instead dissolved in it, in its thinking, its existence, and its action, and is at its mercy. It is the return of everything universal into the certainty of itself, which in consequence is this complete loss of fear and of essential being on the part of all that is alien. This self-certainty is a state of spiritual well-being and of repose therein, such as is not to be found anywhere outside of this comedy. Paragraph 747 is now bringing this subsection of the religion in the form of art, namely the spiritual religion, to a close. And it's bringing us to the cusp of the final, not subsection, but simply section of religion, which is the revealed religion. And so what we have here is, for Hegel, who's rather schematic about these sorts of things, we're having a transition from this second section, which was primarily about Greek and Roman religion, to now considering revealed religion, which will be primarily Judaism and Christianity, and going through different permutations of Christianity, leading up ultimately to the end where we're getting ready to move from religion altogether into philosophy proper in absolute knowing. And we're getting quite close to the end of the work of the phenomenology of spirit at this point. So, how does this section end? Well, with a little bit of laughter, you could say, because he says, we have comedy, it's the very last word of this section, and he's talking about self-certainty, a state of spiritual well-being and repose within, which is not to be found anywhere outside of this comedy. As I pointed out many times, this is not an analysis of comedy as a genre of such or of the comedic in human beings. And, when we think about what comedy means for Hegel, it's really this movement, at least in this work, not necessarily everywhere else, but in this work, it's a movement away from all these previous ways of relating ourselves to the divine and understanding ourselves in relation to it. Now, as he starts out, fate, Schicksal, is before, well, let's start with the text. Fate, which up to this point has lacked consciousness, right? So it's not a subject. It's something that we run into along the way. We're like, oh, crap, we thought we had some meaning going on and we followed things out and boom, there's fate or necessity or whatever. It's got different names. And what else? He says it's an empty repose and an oblivion. Okay, it's, again, lacking any sort of determinate meaning. And was separated from self-consciousness. Very important there. Now, he says, this fate is united, vereint, with self-consciousness. How can that be the case? Well, self-consciousness is that very fate. That's how, right? It's no longer something that's totally outside of it, separate from it, where self-consciousness is losing things that it valued. Now it is part of self-consciousness. He says, the individual self is the negative power, the Kraft, through which and in which the gods and their moments, existent nature, the thoughts of their specific character, vanish. What else vanishes as well, or loses some of its meaning? I mean, they're not vanishing altogether. They are being evacuated of agency and meaning. The cult and mystery that he talks about a little bit later when he says, this unity is not the unconscious unity of the cult and the mysteries. Instead, we've got something different going on. a different kind of unity. And these are vanishing. So we should now look back at the text, which talks about the individual self. Here we go. The individual self is not, and here Hegel's using some really interesting terminology, not the emptiness of the disappearance. Of the disappearance of what? Of the disappearance of the subject, of the disappearance of these things. Emptiness, Leerheit, void, we could say, right? An emptiness of disappearance. An emptiness in which disappearance fits into, figures into, an emptiness that swallows them up. We should think about this a little bit. Because then, immediately afterwards, he's going to talk about a different kind of emptiness, a different kind of void. One that perhaps is more active. He says, it preserves itself. The individual self preserves itself in this very nothingness. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to say? Hält sich in dieser Nichtkeit selbst. Selbst, a self of nothingness. If we want to be literal and play around with the words, it's an intensifier, right? This particular nothingness. How is this nothingness any different than any other nothingness, like a nothingness that we can imagine, or so-and-so's nothingness? Well, there's literally nothing separating them. Here we start to sound rather Heideggerian or Sartrean, but Hegel is already playing with this dialectic long before them, isn't he? And how is this nothingness, this Nichtkeit, different than Leerheit and emptiness? Is it a matter of function? These things are swallowed up in that, but the individual self preserves itself in its nothingness. There's nothing separating those either, if we want to, again, play in a Heideggerian sense. So he says, it preserves itself in this very nothingness. It abides with itself. It is self-consciousness, right? And it is the sole actuality, the only thing that really is or exerts itself. Now, he says something else that's very interesting here. In this, the religion of art is consummated and has completely returned into itself. He doesn't say in it religion per se, or all the earlier forms of religion. He's concentrating on the religion of art. The religion of art is consummated, vollendet. Vollendet can also be translated as fulfilled, or if we want to think about this in a very Greek, ancient Greek sense, it has been brought to its telos. It's sort of like teleutauin, to be brought to, which we often translate as fulfilled, right? Or perfected is another way of translating it. It has been brought to its fruition, its purpose, its end, its what it was supposed to develop into. So that is quite an interesting thing to say. The religion of art is consummated, and he says, through the fact that it is the individual consciousness in the certainty of itself. Certainty of itself, that's an important term there, right? Hegel often has this dialectic where we begin with certainty, and then we move into truth, and we lose the certainty on the way, and then we want to come back to certainty. Certainty of itself in relation to truth, in relation to its other, or the other others. That is what's going on here. It has self-certainty, and it exhibits itself as this absolute power. So he says, the latter has lost the form of something presented to consciousness, something altogether separate from consciousness and alien to it. And now Hegel says that these other things were, in fact, alien to it, even though they really weren't. The statue. We can think about the architecture as well in the natural religion, right? That's being developed. In a sense, it is alien. It's the God. It's something greater than me, but it's also something I work on as the craftsperson or worship as the cult member. And then we have the living, beautiful corporeality. Remember the dancer being discussed before as part of like a living work of art, right? And then we have, he talks about the epic and tragedy, and he brings up the content, the inhalt of the epic, and the powers and persons of tragedy. So with each of these, we've moved to like something new, and there's the possibility of us kind of distancing ourselves and being spectators of that and being like, oh, that's really cool. I belong to this community of worship that cares about this, and this represents me, but that's not me. Well, now I can realize, no, those things, they are for me. I'm kind of the judge of them, right? I'm the one, or other like me individuals are the ones who give them animation, who give them agency, who give them intention. And he goes on and says, this unity, we brought this up, is not the unconscious unity of the cultic mysteries. On the contrary, the actual self of the actor coincides with what he impersonates. The God or the hero impersonated by the actor is for the actor, and the actor chooses what they're going to do with it. Just as the spectator is completely at home in the drama performed before him and sees himself playing in it. Different relation of the spectator at this point now. And they're not losing themselves in the actor's portrayal in a purely imaginative way. This is more thoughtful. This is more dialectical. And for that reason, you could say that the performance is something we can judge, we can appreciate, but we can't fully lose ourselves in anymore. So he says, what this self-consciousness beholds is whatever assumes the form of essentiality over against it. So the gods, the heroes, the cult, the statue, is instead dissolved in it, in its actuality, in its, as he says, its thinking, its existence, and its action, and is at its mercy. Before we could say there was a relation in which the thing that was being projected as essential, a vase in height, was above the human spectator or actor, and now the position has reversed. The human being is revealed as the one that has all these other things at its mercy. And so he says, it is the return of everything universal into the certainty of itself, which in consequence is the complete loss of fear and of essential being on the part of all that is alien. So the fear is lost on the part of the individual, and the alien thing, essential being, is lost on its part. So this produces, like he says, a state of spiritual well-being and repose through comedy. Now, is this like going to the stand-up and, that's so funny, listen to them, and that produces that? No, this is something quite different that Hegel is talking about here. Don't confuse this with the genre of all the things that we call comedy, but instead think about this as the revelation of what tragedy, epic, drama in general, statuary, dancing, all the things that go into the religious cult turn out to be. Something that wasn't available to the previous consciousnesses that were working out and working through and working upon all of these things that constituted the religion of art.